Welcome. This is the Drupal usability meeting for June 30th, 2023. I'm Benji Fisher, sharing my screen and moderating, and also present are Eric Rubino, Ralph Kohler, and Thomas. Thank you for coming. Actually, before we start looking for an issue, let me just point out something. I have here the current 11.x branch. We changed the branching policy a month or two ago. So instead of the 10.2.x branch, we're working on the 11.x branch. This is stuff that will go into 10.2 though. And one thing I would like to point out is that the help pages with, I guess this is the Umami profile, as you can see from the toolbar. But I think you'll get the same thing with the standard profile. You now have the topics on the main help page. That used to be there only if you enabled the experimental help topics module. But that module has now served its purpose. It is just a stub, and all of the functionality from the help topics module was moved into the help module. So you have this getting started section to configure your website with links to the main admin page and the main config page, links to the modules or extend page, customize your design, go to the appearance page, and add new content. And then this sort of topic-based help. We still have the old help pages, one for each module, and some of them have links to additional pages. I think that's going to be deprecated, but that hasn't happened yet. But at any rate, it's below this new topic-based organization. So that's a huge milestone that I know the documentation maintainers have been working on that for years now, and it's I'm kind of glad to see it finally finally get to this stage. So that's something to look forward to in Drupal 10.2. Any questions or comments about that? Seeing none, so let's start looking for issues. Here's the issue for today's meeting. It's 336-8832. I don't see any requests. The issue for the previous meeting, let me just reload it in case anyone has added anything to it. This lists a bunch of things we could look at. Anything here that strikes your fancy? I guess the other thing to check is that Stephen Musgrave, who heads the review queue initiative, has suggested one. So let's have a look at this. So this is issue 2619328. A required Boolean field behaves differently depending on the widget. And it says that if a Boolean field is set to required, behavior is different depending on the widget. If there's a single checkbox, the checkbox is shown as required, and the user must enter the on value. With the radios widget, a set of on-off radios is shown. User must have either the on or the off. I'm sorry, the user must enter either the on or the off value. So let's see if I can see what this is talking about. Just, oh, not this one, this one. Move this tab to the end. So let's go to some content type. Say basic page, and let's add 2 Boolean fields. Yes or no. One value, say field settings. And if Boolean field is set to required, so I think we want to check that off. And just to match the label I gave the field, let's change those labels and save settings. And then let's add another field, also Boolean, on or off. One value, also make it required. Keep the on off labels. And then go to manage form display. And keep the single on-off checkbox for yes or no, but use checkboxes or radio buttons for on or off. Also, let me just have a look. I'm not sure what these settings are, whether to use the field label. And yeah, I do want to use that. So now let's add or edit, or probably simpler to add a new one. That was a basic page, right? Okay, so here this is required. You know, both fields are required. They're both Boolean. And then what's supposed to be the difference? So the single checkbox widget, the checkbox is shown as required. So you're not really given a choice. Let's see if that's true. If I try to save, oh, well, test page, Booleans. Please check this box if you want to proceed. So I cannot save the page without checking the box. So the issue does seem to be correct. There is no way to set the Boolean off if I use the checkbox widget. Ralph, you're unmuted. Do you want to say something? Or anyone else?
You already did what I wanted to suggest, to go back in and try to save again with unchecked. Thank you.
Thomas, go ahead.
This may not be a popular opinion, but to my mind, that means it's working as intended. With a radio button, it is not a radio button has to have a state. So if you're requiring it, then it's going to have a state. And I think of it in terms of when I was working with Salesforce, for instance, when I was working with other systems and you added a Boolean to something, in that instance, it automatically had whatever the starting state was. You didn't get a choice in that starting state. If it was off, then it would have started with off and it would auto-populate. So in the second instance, to me, that's working as intended. In the first instance, with the checkbox, I don't know why a checkbox would be required. Because in my mind, a checkbox is always optional. So it's working as intended because you shouldn't, I don't think Drupal has the capacity to not allow a widget type to be not required. So in the second instance, in the radio button, that's working as intended. If it has to have a value, because it's required, it has to have a value. And the first one, because it can only have a value, it only has a value when a checkbox is there. So we can say that we want to change how that works. Oh, there's an in-depth comment. Should we read that, Ralph?
No, it's just an additional comment. It's not related to what you are explaining right now. It just wanted to add it and point to it because.
So I guess to answer the issue that was brought up, I wouldn't put both of these things in the same bucket, because to me, one is working as intended and the other is working as intended but doesn't make logical sense. In which case you could say that if the checkbox is required, then when it is unchecked, it puts into the database a value of no. But there would be no way to see that. And if someone after the fact made the field no longer required, then you'd end up with three states. You'd have null, yes, or no, which by definition means the field is no longer Boolean. Because Boolean gives you only two values. So again, it seems like a weird edge case with the checkbox, and the radio button is working as intended.
Okay, so certainly the radio button works as intended. There's no problem there. And with the checkbox, there's no way to save the page without first checking the box. So there's no way to save the page with a value of no. And sort of behind the scenes, even a Boolean, in a sense, has three options. One is null, that there is no entry in the database table for this node and this field. And then the two options that are really intended, that there is a value in the database table for this field in this node, and it's either 0 or 1. Go ahead, Thomas.
I disagree. Like, if it's required, that means null is not a valid value to have. It can be a legacy value. So if a field were changed from not required to required, it is possible that the database would have a null, but then I wouldn't want the form to be saved.
That's right.
So the first one, the problematic behavior is that with that widget enabled, it should be saving no automatically to the database on save. But I don't know, like, that may require significant coding, because then it's treating these as two different Booleans.
Yeah, the widget is certainly restricting whether or not we have the option of saving a 0 to the database. Go ahead, Ralph.
I wonder if it would make sense if you make a Boolean field required to make the set default value required as well implicitly, because that way you would avoid those issues. For example, set default value for the radio buttons, you have the on or off switches and the three options: NA, off and on available, and for the others the yes and no. And that way you would avoid those edge cases, basically.
Okay, let me do something here. Manage fields. Instead of calling it yes or no, I'm going to change the label to I affirm that this is my original work. No plagiarism. And no help from chat GPT. Make it a required field. So my point is that there is a use case for not allowing someone to proceed unless they check the box. So actually a pretty common use case. Okay,
Good
Thomas, go ahead.
That's really interesting. Like, I hadn't thought of that as two different checkbox situations, because the other one I was thinking, so I agree with you, that is a valid use case that works the way this is. And I agree also with Ralph that a value, like, I don't know the right choice, because I also think a value should be savable. So I feel as if for the state that you're talking about, Benji, that should be a toggleable state within the widget. So within the widget, we should be able to determine, is this a required field, which is this condition, or is this a required field in which we want it to initially be off or no, and then turn on when someone checks it. So like required as the little asterisk at the end, to me means that the form user should be interacting with this field to make the save button active, to make it possible to save. However, there are two different use cases, as you pointed out, or two different widgets. One is a widget that is intended to force someone to, basically, it's the legalese. It's someone is accepting the contract. We do it all the time. You can't go on, the save button's not available until you've pressed the checkbox, and then voila, you can move forward. So it sounds almost like we have three Booleans, and two of them are combined with poor documentation around them. In the former, the checkbox, and in the latter, it's the use case where we need to, if required, then a value must be provided for the starting value, like what's the starting state when the form is filled.
Ralph, go ahead.
Just one question. I agree with Thomas, but I wonder one other detail. If you go into the field settings, and if you go to the set default value for the radio buttons, you have the three radio buttons not available, off and on.
Slow down.
Sorry.
Where do you want me to go?
On or off at the bottom, for example. That is the Boolean one, I suppose, into edit. Yeah.
This is the radio buttons.
Yeah, and if you click the set default value, then you see the three button options not available, off and on. But if you take in consideration the example you've brought up, Benji, right before, with the confirmation that you haven't used any external help, also no ChatGPT, and the option that's basically the same, the not available option is basically the same in checkboxes as well. You have the not set, the set, and the not available one. It's that way, it's not an either or as well there.
Well, I can make the default value checked rather than unchecked. And then when I add yet another.
Technically speaking, is if you the set as default checkbox for that checkbox field is basically the NA option for radio buttons functionally. It is basically the same effect like you have for the radio button.
I think the default is the 0 option.
Yeah, yeah. That I meant with the NA.
Yeah. Thomas?
I guess what I was trying to say earlier is with a required field, null or NA should not be an option. By definition, you can't save to the database for a Boolean something that is NA or null if it's required. Required means that you have to have a value. Because I've seen a lot of bad data in other systems when you don't enforce that. And that's explicit, not implicit. When you require the field, you're explicitly stating with the radio, for instance, it must be off or it must be on. And in the instance where we're looking at the I affirm that my original work, no plagiarism, no help, we're explicitly stating that when you check this, you're making that assertion and that you cannot move on in this instance without making that assertion. And then the third use case being that it was off or on, you have to answer with a checkbox. It would, in my mind, have a required field, but again, NA or null is not a value. It's intended to not be a value, and you can't search or work with data that is null in a way like null means you have no information.
Right.
So it's not fitting the required state.
Okay, so I would say that it is certainly an inconsistency that if you choose the checkbox widget, then people do not have the option of saving saving a false value. It's an inconsistency, but it's a useful option to have. It's one that I think is commonly used for the sort of thing I'm demonstrating here. I think we should have a look at the comments already on the issue. So the use case, I want to add a Boolean base field to an entity. I will allow the form widget to be configurable. The field should always have a value, so I make it required. Okay. And the problem, let's say you choose the radios widget. Yeah, yes. Okay, and the problem, he points out the inconsistency. Maybe if I lift the requirement on the field, things will be better. Now the checkbox widget works as expected, but the radios widget has 3 options. So the proposed resolution is to add a widget setting. so that the checkbox can optionally be marked required if the respective field is marked as required. If this setting is off, you are not forced to check it. Off is a valid state as long as the value being used is an actual no value. The new setting defaults to false, so that by default, checkboxes will not be marked as required. This is a change to the previous behavior. For all existing required Boolean fields that are using the checkboxes widget, we make the setting to true to match the previous behavior. And Ralph suggested that we look at comment number 70. Regarding the comment, you can never unset a value of the checkbox. That's what we've observed. I tried to explain the situation in the comment directly preceding. He says the problem is that both scenarios have valid use cases. First one is, for example, do you want to receive our newsletter, where it totally makes a difference whether someone has explicitly said no or not yet made a choice. The second is, do you agree to the terms of service, where that distinction is meaningless and the required aspect means the yes field is required. So that's very similar to the example I was using. Go ahead, Thomas.
So on thinking about this and reading what's wrote here, it sounds like this explicitly writes out both the full issue description that you've just read through, as well as what we've read through in this issue thus far, gets at all the points that I had been trying to make. The important thing here for me is I'm questioning whether or not from a data perspective, if the field is required. So the example that we give here is not the terms of service, but the do you want our newsletter? Do you want to receive our newsletter? You are not, as a form filler, as a person interacting with the form, you're never saying no. And you may not be aware that you're saying no. It's the opt-in versus opt-out. So I don't know if this use case is a valid use case, is what I'm trying to get at. The do you want to receive our newsletter? That would be a radio button use case for a Boolean, where you are letting the form user know that they're choosing between yes or no. We assume or infer that the user is aware that they are declining to get the newsletter. But if they read over it and missed seeing that, they may not know that they are now making a decision, that they are opting out by not interacting with that field. So to me, the idea of it being a required field, it isn't a required field in that instance, because the user is not required to think about and explicitly state no. They are implicitly stating no, which makes it an unrequired field. So by virtue of making the checkbox Boolean required, that to me means that the user must think about and interact with that particular field line. And that's I guess, why I see the use in having the two different use cases for checkbox, but it would be a definition difference between the checkbox and the radio button, because the radio button makes explicit the data and the user chooses between two data point or two values for that field. And in the former one, if it's not acting as required. And so I guess that comes down to, what does required mean within the context of fields for a Drupal node?
Yeah, and I guess there are two meanings of required. One is at the database level, that we're not going to allow saving a record without putting a value into it. And the other is at the form level, where the widget is marked required. And I think that's sort of the root of this issue. I'm leaning towards won't fix because we have a valid use case for the current behavior. It's something that a lot of people have used, and I don't see, no one is forcing you to use the checkbox. If that's not the behavior you want, then don't use the checkbox, use the radio button. Go ahead, Ralph.
Just one question for from a non-technical perspective. On the database level, is it okay or desired to have a non-value for a field? Meaning at all, or should there always be a value?
There are reasons to not have a value there. To me, that is the database definition difference between required and not required. If it's not required, null is a valid field state to have in the database. But if a field is required, that means you want some data there. And that it comes down to like null explicitly means you have no information about a field. And if you have no information about a field, that is the opposite of being required. Because you could assume anything about it. And when you're doing data analysis, you can assume anything you want, not correctly, but you will assume anything you want about a null field because null means null. Whereas no and yes have well-defined meanings.
But then I don't understand it. Then, for example, if you have a case of a not required field, for example, for checkboxes, then how do you distinguish if a not checked checkbox is null or no?
Well, that's like an unchecked checkbox that is not required. If it's null, it means that a person hasn't interacted with it.
No,
In theory, you
but
could.
Thomas, if you've saved a node, and and maybe assume it wasn't required, so you're allowed to save it without a choice. It would look the same if the node was saved with a null value or with an off value.
No, I agree. It's the issue is that with the radio button, you can visibly show three states because you can show a dot in off, a dot in on, or a dot in neither. With the checkbox, there is no visual data. There is no data communicated.
Yep.
So you can't tell visually with a checkbox ever whether it's required or not. You can't tell when the null state is.
That's right. You can't distinguish between null and off.
Exactly.
And so it's a behavioral distinction between the two. I just don't like. I'm trying to think through the use cases, and again, like it comes down to from a form perspective, when a widget is required, to me, that means that you're requiring interaction on the part of the form filler or the user interacting with the form. And that has a direct consequence of it means then that a value is saved to the database field.
So let's see what specifically they're asking for in terms of usability. Someone must have added the needs usability review tag. Why? awfully annoying when you search for something on the page and it's invisible, but there.
White one added it in comment number 63.
Yeah, I just got there.
Oh, sorry.
I did some testing with the latest patch. This appears to work as intended. I can find confusing the Boolean field marked required will not be displayed as required unless the new widget setting is also checked. So that's 9, 10. And 12. So I guess my inclination is to mark it as don't fix, but maybe I'm going outside the scope of a usability review when I say that. So maybe we should limit ourselves to if we do fix the issue, then do we approve of the usability of the updated version? Who raised his hand first?
Ralph.
Okay, Ralph, go ahead.
I would vote against the won't fix. It's clearly a confusing matter. I lean towards, in case those fields are required, to my initial suggestion to make it implicit that the user has to decide for the default value of those fields. But then again, the problem is also for the not required field in the context of the checkbox and the inability to distinguish between no value and the no checkbox state. And that way, that's also an issue that would have to be tackled somewhere. But still, I consider the whole topic problematic. And it has to need some fix.
Thomas, what did you want to say?
So I think, unfortunately, I agree, or not unfortunately, it's not the right phrase to use, but I do agree with Ralph. So I guess it's not as simple. I don't agree that we should just close the issue or decline. I believe that both checkbox value approaches are valid use cases. I think that it needs better inline documentation, meaning that within the widget, it needs to describe what the choice is and make available the two different behaviors that might be desired from a checkbox. One being a desired state where, when required, the checkbox must be filled, and we'll call that the terms of service use case. The second use case that would be when required, a choice that has to be made within the widget. A default value must be chosen, and it could be yes, it could be no, but a default value is required. So in both instances, you're either pre-populating the field with a value that gets saved to the database, or you're forcing it to be checked to be yes, because the form isn't intended to be continued or saved until that condition is met. And so it uses the same widget to meet both use cases with inline documentation. So I believe more needs to be done to solve the situation. But additionally, I believe that in the instance of the radio button, that when this field is required, you should not be able to save the form with a default value of NA, and
Okay,
that A value should be chosen.
I think we should have a look at what the current proposal is before saying how we should change it. So I just applied the patch. And let's see, I guess if I mark it as required, I'm guessing that a new form element will be revealed. No. That's funny. On label, off label, choose a default. None of this has changed. Maybe. No, there's nothing here. So there are no additional options on the settings form. You can either mark it required or not. No other changes there. And then what happens? Whoops. It is no longer marked as required. Let me just, to avoid confusion, let me go back and make the on-off one required again. So I can choose that one to be off. Oh, I still need a title. So let me save it without checking the box.
My guess is it's forcing it to no.
I suspect so, yeah.
Which I don't think is a good behavior. So I refer to my earlier comments.
Right, so this patch seems to make it impossible to have the previous behavior. That seems like to me like a non-starter. If you're going to do anything in this issue, you have to make it an additional option in the settings form. Did I? Oh, maybe it's not in the field settings. Maybe it's in the form settings. Here it is. Okay, so
it does exist. Okay.
Yes, it does exist. I was just looking in the wrong place. And if I now require the user to select the checkbox, never sure. Do I have to save the page after I save the settings? That's a question for another day. Whoa. Trying to reload the page. And now when I try to save, it doesn't let me. So this sort of resolves the inconsistency that you can use either widget to save a 0 or a 1. Preserves the ability to use the checkbox this way. It's an additional step. You have to check the additional box. So go ahead, Ralph.
One problem I see with the approach taken in the patch is it is sort of disconnected, and you have missed on your own basically the checkbox in the widget. And wouldn't it make more sense to move that checkbox at least to the field settings? It's in the edit screen of the field itself. If the patch should go through that way.
No, because it only matters if you've chosen the checkbox widget, and that's not a field setting, that's a form setting. So it does belong in the settings for the checkbox.
The challenge is you're forced to look at the settings configuration for the field. You're not forced to look at the display page. So when you're building these fields, you will see one area and know what options are available. So I agree it's in the right place. But I worry that approaching it this way, so I would prefer right now, and then there's probably good arguments against it, to see to add two different types of checkbox widgets. So you can explicitly know that you're choosing one behavior or the other. And I don't know how we would do it, but I'd have checkbox and checkbox special or checkbox forced or something like that. But when choosing the Boolean and choosing this way,
Right. So when you add yet another Boolean, oops, I misspelled yet. It doesn't lead you through the form widget settings. I think Drupal 6 did, maybe Drupal 7 did.
And I don't know, like that, to me, that's a bigger issue to talk about whether or not people should be aware of or looking at that. But just in this instance, I would never, if I didn't know this was a difference, it's going to be hard enough knowing that the difference is there, determining when you should use which behavior. But kind of burying it here makes it really hard conceptually. But I do like this. Like, I feel like this issue is going in the right direction, and I like our conversation. I just worry about usability. It's one of those things where I won't remember this in 2 or 3 years when I'm trying to do this.
So perhaps discoverability is what concerns you. Oh, Aaron, you were able to join us. Welcome.
Yeah, I joined like at about 40 minutes into the meeting. I had a prior appointment I had to attend. So I don't quite know what I'm not 100% clear what we're talking about, but what I do know is there is an effort to redesign the field UI. And I believe one of the objectives is to, or at least something that's been discussed in the past, is the idea of kind of flipping on its head the way you add a field. So you pick your widget first, and then you configure it. So I don't know if that helps with what we're discussing, but it sounds like that's a kind of pain point, as you said, the discoverability of the form display settings.
That would certainly make a difference to this issue. So again, what was the specific request in number 63? What I find most confusing is that Boolean field marked required will not be displayed as required unless that new widget setting is also checked. Is there some way to inform the user? This specific question doesn't bother me because what this issue is doing is separating the required in the sense of the database table from required in terms of the form element. And the two are different. And the user doesn't need to know about the data model. The user doesn't need to know that no way is this form going to save a null value. It's going to be either 0 or 1. So this point really doesn't bother me at all. So 2 minutes left. Are we ready to make a recommendation on this issue, or do we want to mull it over a little bit further? It is awfully hard when no one has looked at the issue before the meeting started to come to a resolution. Go ahead, Thomas.
I don't think, pending the other issue that Aaron mentioned, like hearing resolution over there seems like a dependency of this one. The discoverability, if that changes, impacts this issue. So then the question just becomes like, I feel like we all have kind of come to consensus that we like it being made explicit and we like having both behaviors available. So it sounds like we're behind this issue, that we have come to consensus on it, despite having not read the issue prior to coming to the conversation. The bigger issue is discoverability and the concerns around discoverability, and that may be impacted by another issue. Do we need to wait on that other issue, or can we say this appears to behave the way we want? But then the question I have is, should we keep should the change be inverted? So right now it's allowing the form to be saved and forcing a value of no. Should we keep the same existing behavior and make it possible to change? So the only recommendation being that they switch.
Well, you can keep the previous behavior just by making this box.
No, I agree. I'm saying, should that box be checked by default so that it behaves the way it already does today? So we're not
Okay.
inducing
Yeah,
that behavior change.
so yes, certainly there's a question of whether what the default value should be. And the issue talked about preserving the existing default for existing fields, but changing the default value going forward. So we are at the end of the hour. Aaron, if there's an issue that talks about that proposed change for the field UI, could you find that and add it as a comment to this one?
Yeah, I don't know. I know I've seen it somewhere ages ago. I know there is obviously an effort going on around kind of the field UI UX.
Yep.
So it's possible it's within that kind of collection, but yeah, I'll see if I can dig it up.
And does anyone volunteer to write a comment on this? I think I can summarize our concerns, but I don't think that we have a firm recommendation yet. Does anyone else want to do it? Okay, then I will leave a comment, and maybe we can come to an actual decision offline. So thanks for coming. Thanks for staying a minute over. And I'll be back next week.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Benji.